I'll just hang near the front.
Yes, sir. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we're not coming back.
Okay. Hey, how are you?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to AFSA. We're so pleased to have with us Ambassador Chris Hill and Julie Hill from Denver. And I don't need a long introduction for this gentleman. He's had a storied career. Ambassador 4 times, Macedonia, Poland, South Korea, last Iraq, as well as Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs. And his book is fantastic. I can tell you, it reminded me of how cool it is to be a Foreign Service officer. And lots of great anecdotes. I'm jealous of his memories, his ability to remember everything he's done. So with no further ado, and we'll have a time also for Q&A at the end, here's Ambassador Chris Hill.
Wow, well, this is fun. I just walk in and see all these people I know. Wow. Anyway, well, thank you, Bob, and thank you for allowing me to come. And I won't be able to get away with too much with this audience. I mean, kind of know the lay of the land out there, but it's a pleasure to be almost back in the State Department.
Should be arranged probably.
Yeah. You know, I just love looking out over the East Street entrance and realizing it never will get. It'll eventually be one of those things in, Greek mythology that never gets done. So, speaking of never getting done, so I wrote a book, and first thing to understand about writing a book is it's a crass business. You have to hold it up, and and I gather we can't sell books here, but you can you can buy them in your neighborhood bookstore. You can order it online, so you can get it. It's a bargain, I guess. But looking out over some of these very familiar faces, many of whom know some of these stories, some of whom were actually in the book. You can all do the Washington read and check the index. I must say, I don't know about you all, but when I never thought I'd write a book. I just thought that was well beyond my capabilities. In the Foreign Service, I don't think I ever wrote anything more than 2 pages. And no one ever read page 2. I mean, I get to that executive summary, I got a hill. That's I know where you're going with this. So it was just kind of weird to get on to page 3 and realize I'm in terra incognito, and then sort of like that scene in Forrest Gump. I kept on writing and kept on writing, and then I stopped. The first thing I had to do was to get a publisher, and I was very pleased to get Simon & Schuster, which is of course one of those iconic publishers. And then so I was very pleased, and I'd send little emails to my editor, and then I never get anything back. And then I wrote a couple of chapters and sent them to my editor, and never heard anything. And I thought, I think I've made a mistake. And so it wasn't until I had the whole thing done, and I sent it to Simon & Schuster, and kaboom, they came back with a lot of suggestions. My editor is someone named Alice Mayhew, who's just one of these unbelievable people. And she had little, comments, but I want to stress that in today's book editing world, they don't write the book for you. So every word in this was written by me, and many of the words that didn't make the final edition, because she would say things like, "Well, you already said this on page 173." And sure enough, so it was quite a learning experience. And originally, I was sort of thinking, I do kind of fun Foreign Service stories, followed by admonishing lecture on, what our world means, etc. And she said, you know, no one wants to read that crap, you know. You know, the stories, if they're done right, are stories that should mean something to people. And people should be able to generalize from these stories about, you know, my view of how we need to deal with the world. And so I really just continued to work on the stories. And of course, you have to set context. I mean, context is important in anything you do, and people cannot, you know, understand, you know, Macedonia or Kosovo without understanding the sort of historical context of where you are. But I think one thing I wanted to make clear is that no one is indifferent to our country in the world. Everyone has an opinion, and what you strive to do is make sure that that opinion kind of jives with an approach that we have, so that in the fullness of time we can work with these countries and often get leaders and get interlocutors to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And so at the end of the day, what is it about? It's really about building relationships. And I say that not to be critical of the sort of the social media approach or public diplomacy, because Lord knows we need more about that, but to really say that a lot of what we have to do is to deal with people and personages through, you know, sort of traditional channels of talking to them privately, praising them publicly, and giving them sometimes unsolicited advice privately. And so it certainly, you know, you can be certainly, if you're overseas and you say, you know, this government here sucks, you'll get people back in Washington saying, finally, we have an ambassador who tells it like it is, you know, who really points out the problems with that country there. Well, that's great, and you could win a popularity contest in Washington that day, although often you're just that day sort of junk food. I mean, you know, they're on to something else the next day. But it makes your job impossible in doing what you really ought to be doing when you're out there in one of these outposts, which is keeping the door open to the local government and making sure that you're always received, no matter how tough the moment, how difficult the time, that they will always want to hear what you have to say. So often you go into these you know, judgment-challenged governments and say, Mr. Prime Minister, we've had this discussion before. I told you you'd get this kind of reaction back in Washington if you arrested that guy. I told you. And you try to kind of build that kind of relationship rather than a relationship where you have tweeted out in 144 characters, this government sucks, which by the way is less than 140. So I think to some extent our profession, it's not the oldest profession in the world, but I think it's one that's been around for a long time, and it's really about building relationships and making sure that people, even if they don't want to do something, that you convince them to do it, because even if they don't want to do it, they do it because they value the relationship with you. So I spend a lot of time talking about these things. I think anybody who has spent time in the Foreign Service, you know what mentors are. You know people who've kind of noticed you down there and say, hey, I'm going to help that guy. Or, you know. And so I talk about some of the mentors I have. And I think it's also important, and I know everyone in the room shares this, that it's one thing to have been helped by people, but you got to give back or pass it forward. And so you've got to be helping other people and understand that, you know, at the end of the day, the EER process, much as we love it, isn't necessarily going to make sure we have the best Foreign Service officers rising to the top. There needs to be an understanding that you need to help train people and help them succeed, so that they will eventually be the people who carry forward these proud traditions. I must say, you know, I started writing the book. Yeah, I have a full-time job. I'm dean of the International School at the University of Denver, and so I couldn't write the book during the day simply because you can't get into the sort of transformational. I mean, you can't be sitting there and kind of thinking that you're back in in Iraq in 2009 if you've got some professor complaining about his course load pounding on the door. So so I ended up getting up at 4:45 in the morning every morning, making a very huge cup of espresso with a little milk in it, and then working 2 hours on the writing. It's a memoir, so I don't have a lot of footnotes. I have some, and I certainly have some notes. And people always say, "Well, how did you remember all these quotes? How'd you do all that?" And I said, "Well, I did have some notes that I had taken, so some material of that kind. I had people who took notes for me in meetings, for example, with the North Koreans and the Chinese, for example. Sometimes I would remember something, and then I would call back to a colleague who was there in the room with me, and just to make sure. And by the way, you will find your memory is surprisingly faulty on a lot of these things. You sometimes have the cart before the horse. You really, it's often very difficult to remember things in the sequence. I had some of my messages to people that I kept in unclassified form, so I was able to call on those. And then you'll notice most people who are quoted, many of them are no longer with us, so you can challenge some of those quotes, but you may have to wait yourself. But I certainly tried to be as accurate as I could be. And people, my first meeting with Dick Holbrook, by the way, there's no Richard in Dick Holbrook. He was a dick from start to finish. So Dick Holbrook. And Julie, that was just a little joke here. My wife Julie is always kind of looking at me. So anyway, when I first met Dick Holbrook, and he offered me a job, and I tried to find out what the job was that he was offering me, and he kept wanting to watch Andrew Mitchell on NBC Nightly News, and he would occasionally mute her and then ask me something, and then he would at one point actually pointed the mute button at me to hear me. So those are moments you just don't forget. You just don't forget them. And the other thing is as you write, as you're getting into something, things come back that you haven't really thought of in a long time, and so that's a great feeling when Julie will recall walking upstairs in our house and hearing me laugh and saying, what's going on? I say, I just remembered something I hadn't thought of in years. So so things start coming back, and it's like watching a good old movie. You start getting transformed by it, and think you're in it. So for those of you contemplating a book, I say go for it, because I don't think there's any better feeling in the world than to try to put down your thoughts in this very old art form that I think has been around some thousands of years, and notwithstanding Twitter accounts will be around for thousands more years. I should say a little maybe about this several crises that I dealt with, but what I really want to do is go to some questions, because I know a lot of you know as much about these issues as I do, and so it's a kind of different audience from many of the audiences I've dealt with on this. But essentially, the book deals with my career. It talks about some of the important, for me, things that were important. For example, being in the Peace Corps and having the opportunity to. I confronted this credit union board of directors with a problem where most of the loan money was going to some tiny percentage of the credit unions in rural Cameroon, West Africa, and then getting up and in front of the 600 people general meeting and essentially denouncing this board as being corrupt, and people applauding me, standing up, saying thank you for bringing this out. I mean, the support I felt, and I was like 22 years old, but I remember it so well, being out in this grassy meadow near where the tea plantation was, and just this great feeling that I am changing this credit union into something that will be actually well run, and everyone's so grateful. So I said, and now I would like to propose a new board of directors, and I had found a group of people that I thought were pretty good, and the way voting worked in rural credit unions in Cameroon was it wasn't a show of hands or much less secret ballots. What it was you'd have the old board out on that part of the meadow, and then the reform board over here, and then people just kind of fall in and you count heads. And so something like 90% of the people voted for the old board. Maybe a few relatives voted for the new guys that I had come up with. And I looked at it and I thought, what happened? And the answer was, I didn't really understand what I was doing. I didn't understand that people were in charge of the credit union for different reasons. Running a good credit union, maybe not on the top of that list. And so, and I understood too that, because I had done some sampling of opinion, and everyone was very positive to me. They said, "You're absolutely right. These people have not performed well. They need to be called out on this," or words to that effect. And so what I realized was, just because people say nice things to you, and just because people suggest that you're right in calling these people to task, doesn't mean that they're going to vote for your group of people. And without being too much of a sounding too much like some Mother Goose story, I really think we got to think about this the next time we're in some country and we think we can figure out a better government than the people there have selected. So I learned that experience when I was 22 years old. The book goes on to talk about some of these adventures in Bosnia and in Kosovo and Macedonia, dealing with bad guys. I mean, certainly I think Milosevic fits the bill for that. And I remember at the time he was saying, "How can you talk to him?" Well, first of all, I was being asked to talk to him by our Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, if people, we shouldn't be talking to Milosevic over Kosovo, fine, give me some new instructions, but for now, I'm doing what I'm being told to do. And I felt to some extent, and this is a problem I think that has bedeviled our Foreign Service, and especially in recent years, although this certainly came up the whole China debate in the 1940s, which is that the idea that our diplomats should only be talking to certain people and not to other people. And first of all, I think the correct place for this to get adjudicated or dealt with is at the level of the person issuing the instructions, in that case Secretary Albright. But certainly later on, when I'm dealing with North Korea and dealing with the North Koreans, we had a vice president at the time who clearly didn't support this. And in fact, if you look at his book, and please don't buy it, but a whole chapter devoted to what terrible people Secretary Rice and I were in carrying on this negotiation with the North Koreans. And my view is, rather than wait 4 years to write it in his memoir, he might have, walked down the corridor and spoken to the president. I don't approve of this policy, and if the president bought his argument, that would have been the end of negotiating with the North Koreans. By the way, as a general concept, let me just mention that I felt I should stay away from any score settling in the book, but for that former vice president, I just thought I'd make an exception. I think we have, in the Foreign Service, you're often asked to do things that you may not agree with some of those things, although I felt negotiating with the North Koreans or negotiating with Milosevic were the right thing to do. But even if you don't agree with it, I think it's up to every Foreign Service officer to say at some point, I don't want to do this, and I see this as a pattern in this organization. I don't like this pattern in the organization, and so I'm going to quit. I mean, that's always out there. I did not put this in the book because I thought it was sounded a little maudlin, but I always kept on my desktop a letter of resignation. Dear Secretary Rice, I'm today informing you that I wish to resign from my position. And I had it there, and I had it there not because I was planning to resign every day, but I wanted to kind of remind myself that any time I didn't want to do this job, out I go. No problem. No one's holding a gun in my head demanding that I deal with the North Koreans, who, you know, they are truly people only a mother can love. But, so I think, you know, having to do things, dealing with difficult people, what I do think that the Foreign Service needs more of is, you know, and we faced this in the 1940s. I mean, every day I'd walk into EAP and I'd walk past pictures of Sargent and some of these other people who were severely criticized for so-called losing China. And so I think we do need people in Washington need to cover our back. And maybe even sometimes better than they do. And I think we need, you know, for us to go out and do the nation's business and to deal with these terrible people, we can't cover our own back. I mean, covering, you know, to get up and I was talking about social media earlier, and to try to curry favor back here because you think it'll give you a little more running room, and then lo and behold, because I've you know, said you know, something terrible but something honest about some miserable government, then I can't go and see that miserable government the next day. Someone else needs to be doing that and making sure that critics of the policy don't think that this is that it's kind of open season on the poor person out there doing the negotiating. I think that needs to be kind of tightened up a little, because we live in this so-called information age where everyone has an opinion about everything and you know, expresses those opinions on a daily basis. I think you know, a diplomat needs to be able to go forward and do some of these things, and if the leadership doesn't want the diplomat to be doing these things, that should end immediately. So I think issues like that need to be looked at. I go into a little of this, especially in North Korea, which was probably one of the most difficult places I had to deal with. But as the book, as I describe in the book, I was kind of looking forward to retiring from the Foreign Service in January 2009. I'd been Assistant Secretary for 4 years. I dealt with the North Koreans for that time. So I was all set to leave, and then Secretary Clinton asked me to come upstairs at 4:30 in the afternoon. I thought she wanted another memo on North Korea, because after all, there was this view, I didn't particularly subscribe to it, but a lot of people did, which was that the North Koreans had turned very difficult in the fall of 2008, because they were going to wait for the next administration to come in and see if they could cut a deal with the next administration. In fact, the North Koreans had kind of throttled back on any kind of negotiating process in the fall of 2008. You recall Kim Jong-il had become Kim Jong very ill at the time. He had apparently suffered a stroke in the summer, and so that was one theory, that they weren't getting kind of clear answers from leadership, and that's why they weren't dealing with us. But so there are a lot of theories of it. So she asked me to, I was asked to go up there at 4:30, and I walk into Secretary Clinton's outer office, and I noticed there had been a little furniture rearranging from when Secretary Rice had been there just a few days before, checking out the feng shui of the room. And she sits me down and says all these nice things about you know, my service, and I'm sort of feeling like, you know, Frodo Baggins or something. And then she said, so. And I thought, oh, here's coming, another memo. And she said, so, I'd like you, if you could perhaps replace Ryan Crocker and go to Iraq. So I kind of looked at her and I said, well, let me make 3 points on that. I'm very honored. I know how important it is, and I'm going to have to think about it. And so I thought about it, and decided I would do it. I told her I'd do it for one more year. Turned out to be a little more than 1 year because we had an election in the spring of 2010, so it wasn't so easy to leave in the middle of the election. And I had to wait for my successor, who's sitting here in the back of the room, Jim Jeffrey, to leave Turkey and get ready to go. So I agreed to. So I ended up staying into August 2010. And I found that I'm glad I went to Iraq because I think it was one of the probably the most difficult issues for the Foreign Service. There was a perception that the State Department had come late to the action. In fact, I think the State Department had tried to be very early on the action. I think, frankly, was ignored to a very real extent. And I think, but the other issue was that the State Department, I think, fell into the kind of role as a kind of follow-on force to the military. And so, which is not necessarily a position I think the State Department should be in. Obviously it happens from time to time, but I think the State Department put itself in a position where we were seen as the organization that would somehow provide the continuity once the military was gone, sort of war by other means. Then I think one of the big issues in Iraq was to see the size of the operation. Under Chief of Mission Authority, it was something like 15,500 people. There were, a couple of thousand right there in the so-called new embassy compound. And you sort of wonder, well, why so big? And the answer is because that's how the military judges whether you're serious about an issue. The bigger the deployment, the more serious you must be. And I didn't think that was a particularly compelling reason for why Embassy Baghdad should have been the biggest embassy in the world. We happen to have some of the best political officers, in fact some of the best officers I've seen in the Foreign Service, but when I looked at that political section, that's 30 people, all doing sort of political internal. And you sort of wonder, how can 30 people do a job? I mean, how can that work? I mean, people must have very small slices of the pie to have, I mean, every political officer, just ask them, I'm not one of them, but, they always want to have their own little peanut stand where this is, my political party that I'm dealing with. And so, you had some 30 people, some of whom were just sharing these kind of minor fringe parties, 2 people on some, weird little Yazidi party or something. So it was clearly not right-sized, but it was sized in a way to impress another institution that didn't understand us very well. So I kind of go into that. I'm a huge supporter of what the U.S. military has done generally. I think the U.S. military is obviously, without adding to the things that have been said, it is really the greatest military the world has ever seen. It has done things that just are extraordinary in nature. But we should not be sending soldiers to do a diplomat's job. And I think to some extent that's what happened in Iraq. We had a political situation there that was one that we failed to analyze it correctly. We failed to, I think, understand the Shia-Sunni divide, or I should more accurately say the Shia divide with certain radical Sunni groups, Arab Peninsula type Sunniism. So it was, I think, to some extent, it's an issue that's going to be with our country for many years to come. I stopped short in the book, and I stopped short everywhere in saying this was all a big mistake. And the reason I stopped short of saying that is when you serve there, when you know people who have been killed, when you've asked people to do things, and I just don't want to be in a position of telling those people I think what we were doing there was all a big mistake. So I don't say that. But surely we need to think things through a little better before we find ourselves in circumstances of that kind. I think overall, as much as we, and I go into this, finally my editor allowed me to bloviate a little in the last couple of pages of the book about, whither the Foreign Service and whither our country's diplomatic engagement. And so I certainly took that occasion to say that I think our country really needs to be a little careful about how we manage things in the world. We need to be a little less ideological than we've been, and maybe a little more on the practical problem-solving approach that I think we're very good at. In the book, I talk a lot about this kind of practical problem solving. Being an Albanian, 1991, I saw Ella's Biberai there. Ella, it's great to see you. And the things we did by just working our tail off, and we were good at it. And so I think we ought to do a little less talking, a little more of that. And so overall, I think the profession is in good shape. I dedicate the book to members of my family, but also to the men and women of the Foreign Service, because I think anyone and their families who've been out on these outposts knows that you don't have the option of necessarily waiting for guidance. You have to make decisions. You have to be willing to take a chance. In one case, I described, making an audible. Should I meet with these guys now, or should I wait for more guidance? I said, I'm going to do it. And so you have to make these tough calls. Holbrook used to always say to me, the only thing worse than not having guidance is having guidance, because often it's the wrong guidance. And so when you're out there, you've got to be willing to do it. And I think, frankly, the men and women of our Foreign Service have done that very, very well over the decades. So. Anyway, it's available on Amazon.com. So I'm going to take some questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a microphone, I believe. Go ahead.
Be the runner.
Okay, you be the runner.
Okay, so, yes.
Hi, Ambassador Hill. Bill Bent. I'm Foreign Service Officer, and I'm 5 chapters into your book. And it's very good. I'm going to try to ask this as diplomatically as possible, but...
you don't need to do that with me. I'm out.
No, not directed at you, but some of the most interesting anecdotes that I've read so far have to do with Ambassador Holbrook. And, someone who I think is seen as a brilliant diplomat, but also what comes through in some of the anecdotes is that he's a flawed personality. And I'm wondering if you just discuss a little bit about what it was really like to work for him.
Yeah. First of all, this may sound like a philosophical comment, but I think it's just a statement of fact. We are all flawed personalities. And sometimes we kind of rise to the occasion and get some stuff done. And I think Holbrook was one of those people. There was vanity there. There were all kinds of issues. But there was also a kind of, just a very special kind of self-awareness of what our country means in the world, and a willingness to put himself out on a limb and to take a chance on things because he knows the right thing to do. And in describing this complex, let's call him complex rather than flawed, complex personality, to me, and you notice, I think already early in the book I talked about Larry Eagleburger. I have a whole chapter of Eagleburger, but he was kind of a similar character. Certainly larger than life, filled up a room. Both of them had this kind of, very aware of how people were perceiving them. But I think we need more of these people. I think we need more of these people who are, willing to seize the moment of things. And I remember, Holbrook, he'd drive you crazy at times, and it's painful to listen to. And then he'd say something. He would say something that's so brilliant. When we had, we had that contact group plan. Then we had something called agreed principles. And the agreed principles, sort of how we're going to divide Bosnia into these 2 entities, basically. And then he said, now I want to negotiate further agreed principles. And I said, look, I thought the whole point was actually to keep it simple and make sure people were on the same page with it, and let's not make the issue more complex. And he said, this was his favorite line with me. He said, Chris, you've missed the point. We need further agreed principles. We've shown how we're dividing Bosnia. Now we're going to show how we're unifying it. And so in further agreed principles, he wanted to make sure everyone understood it was part of the first agreed principles, that further agreed didn't mean less important. So it starts with the number 4, fourth principle, and kind of continues on from there. Just a kind of brilliant notion of let's get this first thing agreed, and then when everyone's okay, then we'll go to a slightly harder one, because people didn't want to live together, and show how they're going to be together. And it's kind of a brilliant insight into human nature. It's in negotiating, it's kind of a salami slice thing, you know. I mean, if I'm negotiating, and I do this all the time with faculty, you know, salaries or whatever, you know, you always want to see the whole thing so you can say, okay, I'll agree to this, I won't agree to that. So in this, we kind of salami sliced it, got them to agree to it before there was this other document. Oh, by the way, you got to agree to this too. And, you know, he had these insights. So it's a very special character. And I conclude the book with a story about him soon before he died. Kind of sad, but I just feel, I don't put this in the book, but I feel our country, well, I do put this in the book. I mean, you know, see, he's a Democrat, and so he wasn't in Republican administrations. And, you know, one of the things that, I mean, are we such a powerful country that we can sit people like that on the bench for 12 years at a time? You know, I don't think so. And, you know, we've got this kind of Hutu and Tutsi thing going in this country right now. And so I wish we could kind of come together and do more things together. And I think keeping people like Holbrooke in the field would have been one example of that. Yes?
Could you tell us something about your experience in Eastern Europe, Poland, and Bosnia?
Yeah.
The years that you were there?
Yeah, something about my experiences in Eastern Europe, Poland, and Bosnia, etc. Well, Bosnia I've kind of covered. That's part of the Balkan experience. That was, Holbrooke hires me on to be the Balkan director. We end up in this sort of wild ride to getting the contact group plan implemented, and we did it in a place called Wright-Patterson Air Base near Dayton, Ohio. A lot of people wonder why Wright-Pat, and there were a lot of very technical reasons why we did it there, and some of them are kind of amusing. You know, there was also an unlimited amount of food. I've noticed in international conferences, no one wants to pay for the food, so you know, the military is pretty good about that. And then, you know, figuring out the composite of our negotiating team, and then watching how Holbrooke dealt with back in Washington, and he'd always say, "It is the unanimous position of our team." I go, "What the frick did you ever ask me?" But you know, he'd always try to leverage that. So there's a lot of that stuff in the Balkans, and especially, you know, as we get to Kosovo, the fact that Europeans were not up for another war in Europe, and so anyone who thought, oh, time to start dropping bombs on Serbia, which was everyone's kind of back here, everyone thought, well, that's the quickest way to get this problem over with. The trouble was nobody in Europe accepted that. So a lot of what we're doing in Bosnia was to, in Kosovo, was to kind of, in effect, have a negotiation with the Europeans by trying to sell an autonomy plan between the Serbs and the Kosovo Albanians, such that when it didn't work, there was nobody saying, oh, we haven't tried diplomacy. Oh, yes, we have. So, you know, I go through a lot of that, but I also talk about some of the historical antecedents and especially, you know, my tenure as the first U.S. ambassador to Macedonia. I wasn't even allowed to say the word Macedonia when I was there. I was supposed to say the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, or FYROM, and you would be laughed out of the country if you said that to any Macedonian. So I would start saying things like, "You're a beautiful country," and you know, so there's a lot of that stuff there. Poland, you know, I think anyone who's been in Poland, you know, you may leave Poland, but Poland never leaves you. I mean, it is, you know, that's just kind of a heart and soul kind of country. And so I talk about my experiences there in the 80s, during this martial law period, during this very, very sad period of Polish history. And the fact, and I admit that I basically had given up on it. I just didn't think that Poland would ever be free or ever be on its own. And at that point, I go off to South Korea and think, I've had enough of this. It's just too depressing. And then, the Poles, get people like Walesa. The rest is history. So I go into that and the experience of living there in the 80s. And then the experience of coming back when the film turns from grainy black and white to Technicolor, and you have this high-def, gorgeous view of this country that is just doing all the right things. I spent a lot of time convincing the Poles to send troops for war fighting in Iraq. Spent a lot of time doing that, and they were there. They were there for us during the war fighting phase. And there were only 3 other countries, Australia, UK, and Poland, that were actually fighting. And so I was proud of that. But on the other hand, and I talk about this in the book, I didn't feel good about the fact that things I told them turned out not to be true. And that's something I kind of worry about, I think about a lot. There were not weapons of mass destruction being built in Iraq. So anyway, I think I cover all those areas. And as much as I love Poland, at first I didn't have much about Poland. And my editor said, "Where's Poland?" And I said, she always talks that way. And so I said, well, I just didn't think it was as interesting as sort of the war in Kosovo or something. Put it in. People want to know about that stuff. So there it is. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your presentation today. I look forward to reading your book. I also appreciate that you continue to provide op-ed pieces. The recent one on Iran, I thought was exceptional. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. My name is Robert Dry. And I also happen to be the chairman of the new AFSA, still relatively new AFSA committee on the Foreign Service profession and ethics. And one of the points I wanted to make and highlight is the current edition of the Foreign Service Journal, and there's copious copies out here, is all about the practitioner-theoretician divide. And here you are, a master practitioner, and you've become the dean of the Corbell School. I've taught now at Columbia SIPA, and I've taught at New York University since I retired. And I'll tell you, I find it very difficult to understand theoretical international relations.
Wait, what's that again?
But in any event, number one, I commend AFSA and Sean Dorman in particular for putting together this marvelous issue. Starts out with an article with Barbara Bodine about that divide. But I'd like to I'd solicit from you how it is transitioning from being a master practitioner inside of national security to actually the head of a dean of a very, very highly regarded international relations school, where they probably do teach a lot of international relations theory.
Yes, amazing you just asked this question, because Bob and his colleagues and I were talking about precisely this issue. I think, I haven't read this edition, so I think Julie just took a copy of it off the table there, so I'm looking forward to it. From what I understand, I didn't spend a lot of time in academia. I got my BA from Bowdoin College, and then about 15 years in, I went to the Naval War College, and they gave me a master's. So I had not spent a lot of time in academia, and so I can't really speak to the trends, except to say I have been struck by the gap between this theory and practice. And I've asked people who know something about that gap, such as Madeleine Albright, who teaches at Georgetown, and it's Madeleine Albright's father, who my school is named for, Joseph Corbell. And so I asked her about that, and she told me, she said she's never seen this gap as great as it is. So I think, again, I haven't read this article, but I think you all are putting your finger on an important point here. The reason I'm in Washington, in addition to coming here to AFSA, is I'm also here for AFSA, which is the Association of International Studies Schools. So the deans are all congregating over here in Washington for a couple of days. And I think it's a big problem. The theory, I listen to this theory, and I'm thinking, how could this help me if I were a Foreign Service officer? And I don't get a lot of that. I don't see where this would help me. I think it's very important to understand history. I'd always say that, if you don't know as much history as the cab drivers around here, you're in trouble. And, the cab drivers in Skopje knew a lot of history. And so whenever I'd meet a junior officer as part of the sort of, icebreaker meeting I'd have with each junior officer, I'd kind of quiz them on the local history and see how much they've read. Didn't make them feel all that good, but I was just trying to be polite and see what they know. So I feel that us practitioners need to know a little more about what all went on here. And ancient history can't just be when your predecessor left and you arrived. In ancient history, you need to see the inside of a Balkan history book. So I think there's something that the practitioner world needs to do in terms of some of this. But in terms of academia, this effort to put theories together and also to discuss problems in absolutes. You could say to some extent that the difference between lawyers and diplomats is lawyers want to look back and, see who shot who, and, et cetera, and, what the liabilities are, and diplomats go, I don't care about that stuff, I'm just trying to patch something together for the future. The academics, it's just, they're not claiming they're just looking at everything in retrospective, they're also trying to give you predictive models, which I don't think really work. So I think there's an issue there. And I think there needs to be a much better effort to try to tackle this problem. I was talking to Bob about the fact that AFSA has had meetings with AFSA. And by the way, when the various deans of AFSA sit down together, believe me, we don't give each other, our admissions data and stuff like that. It's a fairly stilted affair in that regard. But I think what we should do is take on that issue and maybe talk to AFSA about this, especially since you've shown an interest in it.
Yeah.
I think it's a big problem. And what I worry about, and now I'm really putting on my dean's hat. By the way, the first time I arrived there, I was 3 days out of Iraq, and I had a new cell phone, actually an iPhone. So what a pleasure that was after. What do we have? The State Department Wang phones or something. I remember, the phone rings and. Looking for Dean Hill, and I said, wrong number. So I wasn't quite used to this Dean's hat, but I will say that, there's an issue. You're asking students to pay tuition now north of $40,000 a year. This is all over. And hey, Russ, amazing to see these faces. When'd you get that gray hair? What's that all about? It wasn't my fault. Russ was in Iraq. So with tuition going sort of north of 40,000, you really got a value proposition that you've got to be able to sell, and you've got to be able to tell these students that you go to our school, you do this master's program for 2 years, and it's going to get you into foreign service or whatever. And I worry about it. And I think, a lot of professional schools, law schools, business schools, international schools, they're all seeing kind of not growing enrollment. And so, and I think because, frankly, the market is looking at this issue. So I think it is high time to try to tie up the practical and the theoretical. And by the way, I don't even like that term practitioner. I use it all the time. I noticed you used it. But, what are we, the nurse practitioners and the doctors? But I guess we're stuck with that.
Thank you.
Yes? Oh.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. My name is Karen Castro. I wanted to know if you had any advice for us that are starting in a foreign service, and if you, looking back, was there something that you would have done differently?
One thing I would have done differently but this is more sort of mid-level and senior level, is I would have done more to work with the Congress because I think increasingly members of Congress are out of town Thursday to Tuesday, and they're not out of town studying Balkan history books, they're out of town raising money. So they're having less and less time to do these international issues, and yet their role in, 150 account or whatever continues to be very important. And I feel that, I brief the Congress and the Senate all the time, but often when I was invited to do so, they'd say, we want a hearing, and would you come and do it? Of course I would, but I would have, if I could have a do-over, I would do more of that and try to really develop the informal, not just with staffers, but with Congress, members of Congress. I did in East Asia Bureau, when we had a new Congress take over. I think I had Falama Vega and I can't remember the other person's name, but we brought these two congressmen to our EAP staff meeting. I did the same with Jim Webb when he took over the Asia subcommittee. So we did some of that, but I would like to do more. In terms of junior officer, my only thing is just keep in mind it's a marathon. It's not one race. It's you'll have some job and you'll wonder, God, do I really want to go there? And then the answer is you do want to go there. And when you get there, you're going to do the best possible job you can do, and you're going to do it with utter joy and excitement, because you need to condition your mind to maintain this constant feeling that this is the best profession in the world. And so if you go and say, oh, I didn't really want to do this, you won't be very good at doing something you really want to do. So you just think of it as sort of mental conditioning from the get-go. A few years ago there was this thing about mentorship. It's funny, there's phases. Now I guess it's all, Twitter accounts, but a few years ago it was, we need more mentors. So, you get these junior officers who come into your office and say, will you be my mentor? And I look at the person, I doubt it. Because in a million years, I never would have asked someone whether they would be my mentor. Don't be so explicit with this stuff. Just, if you want to work with someone, figure out a way to work with someone. Don't go, will you be my mentor? I mean, Eagleburger would have thrown me out the window. Yes.
What does your book say about the pivot or rebalance to Asia? Is it on track? Is it moving forward?
I don't really deal with it too much because it was after my time. Look, I think it's always been an issue. Asia's important. The Middle East is urgent. We need to balance the urgent and the important. We need to do more in these important countries that mean a lot to our future. But you can't get to your future unless you can deal with your present. And we've got problems in the Middle East. And I think to some extent, it had. The pivot, I think, had some unintended consequences. One, that we didn't really care about the Middle East, and this came around the time of the Arab Spring, and I think that gave some of the wrong impressions, because I think we do care about the Middle East. Two, the pivot, is also an effort to answer the age-old question, are we an Atlantic country or are we a Pacific country? Well, come on. I mean, like most multiple choice questions in the Foreign Service, it's all of the above. So, but nonetheless, by so-called pivoting to Asia, we made the Europeans, or some Europeans, feel like chopped liver, and that was probably a mistake, and for which we've paid to some extent. I mean, I don't think Putin invaded Crimea because of our pivot, but I think there was a perception that somehow we didn't care as much as we should have in those countries. So I think that was another unintended consequence. And I think the worst unintended consequence of the pivot has been the notion, because this was not at all what the president wanted, certainly not if you read his speech and listen to everything he's ever said, but this notion that we want to pivot to Asia in order to confront China. And yes, China is a complex issue. There will always be a mixture of cooperation and competition, and sometimes the competition will dwarf the cooperation with China. But we shouldn't be talking about Asia in terms of a kind of Peloponnesian struggle between the rising power and the established power, and so which some people do. I mean, even people who couldn't spell Peloponnesian are talking about U.S. and China as Sparta and Athens. I think that was kind of a mistake. So I think, like a lot of sort of major muscle moves in diplomacy, there's real scope for misunderstanding. I mean, even little things in diplomacy can be misunderstood. Remember the famous scene in Vienna, 1815, when during that negotiation, the Russian ambassador finally slumps over and dies, and the French ambassador asks, "What did he do that for?" I mean, even small things like that get, well, not small to the Russian ambassador, but things like that get over interpreted, and so when you do a major thing like the pivot, be prepared for a lot of goofy misinterpretation, and I think that has been so far the legacy of this. So.
Time for two more questions?
Sure.
Time for last two questions.
I'll be brief. Joshua Lewis, I was a 3161 working in Mosul when you came up for the election day, and I had the honor of trying to explain my 400-page plan in about 5 minutes to you because we were in between visits. But
Well, 3161 is not a computer robot. What it is a section of the Civil Service Act that allows people to be hired on a part-time, on a short-term basis with all the rights of a civil service person.
you encouraged
Joshua,
me
I
to
just
join the
thought I
Foreign
should.
Service, and I did. So I just finished my first.
Oh, really? So I told you to do that? Wow, I asked the sun to rise this morning too. I feel really good about that.
For my next posting, I'm actually going to be going to Skopje.
Oh,
and
wow.
as a political officer.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yes, I know. Lots of weird coincidences here. A lot of the things you highlighted in your book are kind of lingering there 20 years on. And I'm going to be working as a political officer, dealing with a lot of these issues again. And I guess the question is are they insurmountable, or are there things that can be done? I know it's not our place to be doing things, but at the same time, are there things that we can be doing to help bring about some sort of resolution to these conflicts?
Absolutely. I mean, to look at every country is going to have problems, and the issue is not to build monuments to those problems. The issue is really to understand those problems so that when you're finding solutions to them, the solutions have a better chance because you've understood what it is you're trying to solve. I mean, but if you look at Macedonia, which is today a country and which was in the past a question or a proposition, a lot has happened in a positive way. But that doesn't mean all of history's problems have ended for Macedonia, or that history has ended for Macedonia. Macedonia has many issues, and clearly the issue that all these countries have to move to is a state concept of the individual. I mean, rather than these nation state. When I grew up in school, people always say nation state, and I don't know the United States, but nation state in the Balkan means something else. It means that the country of Macedonia is the homeland for the nation of Macedonia. Well, if you're an Albanian, that doesn't quite cut it for you, unless you want to have your citizenship in Albania, which is the homeland for Albanians. So clearly, these concepts kind of lead to a dead end. They lead to a kind of not sectarian. They're not so much sectarian in the Balkans as they often are in the Middle East, as they are sort of an ethnic concept of what constitutes citizenship. So what you want is obviously for citizenship, for people's rights to be derived from, or described and derived from the Constitution, not from their affiliation to to a group. And the further problem with this, of course, is that you have people who, this works fine for the majority, it doesn't work so fine for the minorities. So, shifting to a more of a civil concept of citizenship is the long-term goal, and it will not be solved during your tenure there. But you need to keep it in mind as what they should be striving for. To the extent that political parties can be more issues-based, that's clearly the thing that one should strive for. I think Macedonia is one of those very small countries that has a bit of a chip on its shoulder when big countries come and tell them what to do. So be real careful about that advice giving. Advice is best given by friends, not by people who've just arrived and may not even understand much about your country. So I think the same advice for a junior officer goes for an ambassador. Spend your first time there understanding it, not talking too much, but listening a lot, asking a lot of questions, and understanding the problems, and then making sure that they feel that there is no place in the world you'd rather be than in Skopje. That means a lot to people. And so when people say, "Oh, that foreign service officer is such a homer type, he just loves the locals, he's gone totally localitis," you should go in a way that people are convinced he loves it here. And when they see that you love them, then they're going to love you, and then you'll be able to give some good advice. So.
Last question.
Hey Don, how you doing? Good to
I am well.
Good to see you.
Public diplomacy is become a very large and sprawling field.
Yeah.
And from your level in the State Department, what did you most value about public diplomacy? Which is another way of saying perhaps what should public diplomacy emphasize?
I think public diplomacy is an essential element of diplomacy in the sense that it's not enough just to be accredited to the foreign ministry. You need to be accredited to the people of a country. The foreign ministry or the presidency takes your letters of credence as an ambassador, but the issue is that the people of that country, everyone has an opinion in this day and age. And so I think you need to try to influence that opinion by reaching out to a broad cross-section of people. And so I think the emphasis on people-to-people skills and things like that is absolutely crucial. I describe in the book, Don, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but I talk about setting up this Cafe USA in Seoul, Korea, where we put an interactive feature on our website, and it was kind of cutting edge. Now it's a little laughable, but being an embassy that, despite the high walls and blast resistant windows, etc., we need to do more to reach out to people. Where I part company, though, on all this is I don't think we should be using these broader forums to go and criticize people. I don't like being criticized in public. Countries don't like it either. Criticism and admonishment at times is a necessary element of any diplomatic relationship, but I think we need to be real careful about the concept that we can, go slam them in public so that someone back here is impressed with what we're doing. Because as I said earlier, your main job is as a diplomat, is to keep the door open to the local people, the local government, so that when the balloon goes up, when there's a tough situation, you can get in that door and get stuff done, even though they may not want to hear what you're saying, but you've got to be able to get in the door. And so impressing people back in Washington by being a tough person isn't necessarily going to get you in the door. And people back in Washington need to understand that a role of a diplomat out there is not to be echoing what people back in Washington are saying, but the role of a diplomat out there is a little different, there are different members of the team, and not everyone has the same assignment, and the assignment out there is to make sure they know you, make sure they think well of the embassy, make sure the embassy is welcome when the embassy has an important point to make. So I think we just got to be a little careful on this. And I always worry about metrics, because I think metrics, I mean, I understand metrics, but I think you got to be a little careful sometimes with coming up with phony baloney metrics, and there's none phonier than the notion that the ambassador has umpty-ump followers on his or her Twitter account. I'd like to know the leadership the ambassador has created rather than the followers the ambassador has created. Now there's a corny line, but when you're out of the Foreign Service, you can say that. Hey, thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure. So I don't want to carry this back to Denver. Is there anyone whose birthday's today? Anyone birthdays today? Tomorrow? This month?
This year?
Sold. I'll sign it.
That's what's going to ask, sir, would you mind signing for this? Yeah.
Sure.
I've got a.
We know each other from somewhere else.
No, I'm a foreign, so I've been in for 20 years, but I'm not sure if we've ever worked together. But
Bill, you were on the AFSA board, right?
yeah, I was on the
Good
AFSA
seeing
board.
you. Good. Hey, good.
Oh, I'm not going to, this is a, I'm not going to use this because it bleeds onto the other. Julie has a lead. Oh, okay.
Where are you going to do it?
Yeah, we can do that.
But in the meantime, stand.
Okay, but what's my name? Don't know my name.
Everybody else.
Oh, you're Bonnie? Oh, my God.
I have, yeah. Yeah, I am.
Oh, great to see you. Hey, Sonny, how are you? Great to see you. Good to see you. Oh, yeah, you go before Bonnie Weaver. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry you didn't speak up earlier. I did it right
No, we got some stuff in Albania, but not enough. Julie, Ella's beeper, I think. Are you the Ella's beeper.